Welcome, folks, and let me spin you. A tale of heartache, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds of family that will have you shedding tears of joy by the end. Enjoy the story.
The bitter wind whipped Sarah Jenkins's stringy blonde hair across her face as she trudged down the cracked city sidewalk. It had only been 3 weeks since she was released from prison, but the world was still rejecting her at every turn. She pulled the tattered remains of her coat tighter around her frail body, but it did little to block the bone-chilling gusts. A discarded newspaper tumbled past, its headline blaring in bold letters. Family tragedy in home invasion. The words hit her like a punch to the gut, a stark reminder of the darkness that always seemed to lurk just out of sight in this city, just like the shadows that had haunted her own life. What was the point of trying to piece her life back together? The hole she had dug for herself felt impossibly deep, and the climb back to any semblance of normality seemed too steep. Sarah had never known comfort, stability, or even kindness growing up. Her mother, Nina, was a raging alcoholic, her moods swinging between neglect and explosive violence. Sarah's father had abandoned them before she was even born, just another in a long line of men who ran away from the responsibilities of being in her mother's life. Sarah's earliest memories were not of warmth or love, but of fear and pain. Welts and bruises from the latest man her mother had dragged into their crumbling apartment. But the bruises on her skin were nothing compared to the bruises on her heart. Her mother's venomous words cut deeper than any fist. "You worthless, ungrateful trash!" Nina would scream, her breath stinking of cheap liquor and stale cigarettes. "Why did I ever keep you? You should have been thrown away like the garbage you are." There was no one to shield Sarah from the daily barrage of cruelty. No grandparents, no aunts or uncles to rescue her from the hell she called home. She accepted at a young age that she would never know the embrace of family, the warmth of unconditional love. A bone-deep loneliness settled into her very soul, a constant companion throughout her childhood. By the time Sarah turned 17, she had learned not to expect kindness from anyone. But then she met Paul Thompson. Paul had walked into the greasy diner where Sarah worked after school, his mop of sandy hair falling into his warm green eyes as he smiled at her from the counter. He was the first person to ever make her feel special, like she was something more than the trash her mother always said she was. "You're beautiful," he had murmured one night as they sat in his beat-up old Chevy after her shift. His thumb gently caressed her cheek, his words soft and sincere. "I've never seen anyone as gorgeous as you." Sarah had blushed furiously, certain that he was mocking her. No one had ever called her beautiful before, and she had spent years convincing herself that she wasn't. But Paul's affection was genuine. For the first time in her tumultuous life, Sarah allowed herself to hope for something better, something beyond the constant turmoil of her childhood. Over the next 6 months, she fell hopelessly, deliriously in love with Paul. He showered her with compliments, made her believe that she could be somebody, that she could escape her past. "You're smart, SJ," he would say as they cuddled on his sagging couch. "You've got a good heart. You survived your mum. You could do anything. You could be someone." Paul's words slowly chipped away at the towering walls Sarah had built around her heart. For the first time in her life, she started to dream of a life where she wasn't defined by the scars of her past, a life where she could be loved, where she could be free. When Paul asked her to move in with him, she didn't hesitate. She packed what little she had and left her mother's apartment behind without a second thought. But their happiness didn't last long. Less than a month after Sarah moved in, her mother showed up at Paul's apartment, drunk and screaming. Nina barged through the door, her words slurring as she hurled insults at Sarah, spitting venom in every syllable. "This is the kind of filth you are, girl," Nina bellowed. "You'll never be anything but trash, just like your mama." Paul's face morphed from shock to revulsion. He stared at Sarah, his expression filled with disgust. I can't do this," he stammered, stepping away from her as if she were contaminated. "I thought you were different, but you're just like her." He didn't wait for her to respond. Within hours, all of Sarah's belongings were thrown onto the sidewalk and Paul was gone. Heartbroken and humiliated, Sarah had nowhere else to go. She slunk back to the squalor of her mother's apartment, the same place she had fought so hard to escape. Less than a year later, her life hit rock bottom. Her mother's new boyfriend, Roy, was a vile man who quickly set his sights on Sarah. The tension between them grew until one night, he crossed a line that sent Sarah into a blind rage. She defended herself, but the law didn't see it that way. Despite her pleas, Sarah was convicted and sent to prison. Just months after turning 18, Sarah found herself behind bars, scared and alone. She went into labor while in prison and gave birth to a baby boy. But before she could even begin to process the rush of love she felt for her child, he was taken from her. "It's for the best," the nurse had said softly as they carried him away. "Give him his best chance at a good life." The few minutes she held him, cradled him in her arms, were the most precious and painful of her life. Watching him disappear out the door broke her in a way nothing else ever had. When Sarah was released early for good behavior, she was thrown back into the same unforgiving world that had chewed her up and spat her out. At 24 years old, she was an ex-convict with nowhere to go, no family and no future. She knew she needed steady work, but who would hire someone like her? Her rap sheet and troubled past made finding legitimate employment seem impossible. The thought of going back to the streets, selling her body, or getting caught up in illegal activities just to survive made her stomach turn. She had already lost her dignity once. Could she really do it again? As Sarah walked through the bleak city streets, lost in her thoughts, she heard something that stopped her in her tracks. A distant, muffled cry. She turned and saw an open manhole cover gaping like the mouth of an abyss. Peering inside, she spotted a small boy, no older than 6 or 7, curled up at the bottom, crying out in fear. Without a second thought, Sarah climbed down into the dank darkness. "I've got you, little one," she whispered as gently as she could. "Stay still. I'm going to get you out of here." She scooped the mud-caked boy into her arms and passed him up to the sidewalk before pulling herself out of the hole. The boy clung to her as she rocked him gently, calming his sobs. "Let's get you back home," she murmured. As she approached the modest house in the suburbs where the boy lived, Sarah couldn't help but notice the stark contrast to her own childhood home. The fresh-cut lawns and brightly painted houses were worlds apart from the dingy, decaying tenements she had grown up in. When the front door opened, Sarah gasped. Hanging on the wall was a large portrait, a portrait of her, or at least it looked like her. The woman in the picture had long hair, a light dress, and a softness in her expression that Sarah had never seen in herself, but the resemblance was unmistakable. Before she could make sense of it, the elderly couple who lived in the house appeared in the doorway. The woman's eyes went wide with shock as she stared at Sarah. "Oh, my lord, is that you, Nina?" she whispered, raising a trembling hand to her mouth. Sarah shook her head, confusion tightening her throat. "No, I'm not Nina, but I think you knew her." The elderly man beside her squinted at Sarah, his face clouded with recognition. "Well, I'll be," he muttered in a deep southern drawl, "if you ain't the spitting image of your mama when she was younger." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes as she studied Sarah's face. "We looked for you for so many years," she whispered. "After your mother disappeared, we never stopped." They introduced themselves as Emily and Richard Baker, her grandparents, the family she had never known. Overwhelmed with emotion, Sarah listened as they told her how they had searched for her and her mother for years, how they had never given up hope of finding them. And then came the revelation that shook her to her core. The little boy she had rescued was her son, Max, the baby she had been forced to give up all those years ago. Sarah's heart ached as she looked at the boy she had never had the chance to raise. Now standing before her, loved and cared for by the grandparents she never knew existed. Emily and Richard invited Sarah to stay with them, to rebuild the family that had been shattered by so much pain and loss. "We can't change the past," Richard said softly, "but we can try to make up for some of it now. Stay with us, get to know Max, get to know your family." For the first time in her life, Sarah felt like she belonged somewhere. She had spent her entire life running from her past, convinced that she was destined to be alone. But now, through what felt like a miracle, she had been given a second chance. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she pulled Max into her arms, feeling the warmth of his small body against her.